Welcome to the Australian National University School of Music for one of our ANU public lecture series. This is a very special one because it's being presented by Paul Grabowsky, who is our H.C. Coombs Creative Artist Fellow for 2010. First, I'm honoured to be on the ancestral lands of the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge the first Australians as traditional custodians of this continent, whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history. I pay respect to the elders of the community and extend my recognition to their descendants who are present. And a most appropriate comments because Paul has had a lot to do with Indigenous culture and Indigenous musicians over his career. I got to know Paul in the Northern Territory when I worked at Australian University, and Paul demonstrated a great enthusiasm for engaging with Indigenous musicians, Indigenous culture, both as an educator and a performing musician. For those lucky enough to have experienced Crossing Roper Bar on a date, 22nd of September, that is burned into my subconscious, it was the most quite amazing experience where Paul, the Australian Art Orchestra, and the young Wagalak musicians from Nooka did a performance. It's actually hard to describe unless you're actually there. If you were there, it was a transformational experience. And I must say, I think something culturally for Australia quite a first. And it's actually the first time I've actually really experienced a meaningful interaction between Indigenous culture and Western culture. It really worked. Quite uniquely, it was based around the Indigenous Manakay, the traditional song cycles, and that was its point of departure, its point of growth. So it was quite an extraordinary experience. I'll just tell you a little bit about Paul before I hand over to him. Paul is recognised as Australia's pre-eminent jazz pianist, with over 26 recordings to his name. Paul was also regarded as one of Australia's foremost screen composers, with credits for over 17 films and 13 television scores. His work for the stage include the opera Love in the Age of Therapy, one I must look for, and the multimedia production Theft of Sita. Paul was born in Papua New Guinea in 1958 and raised in Melbourne, Australia. He began classical piano lessons as a 5-year-old, studying with Mac Jost from 1965 to 1978. He began informal studies in jazz around 1976 and devoted his energies fully to improvised music from 1978. He lived in Munich, Germany from 1980 to 85, where he was active on the local and European jazz scenes, performing and/or recording with Johnny Griffin, Chet Baker, Art Farmer, Benny Bailey, Gunther Klatt and Marty Cook, and many others. He returned to Australia in 1986. In 1994, Paul, with the assistance of a small group of committed Melburnians, founded the Australian Art Orchestra and has been its artistic director ever since. Paul produced and presented the television series Access All Areas in January to October 1996 and was commissioning editor for the ABC Television Arts and Entertainment from 1996-98. He was the musical director of Tonight Live with Steve Vizard, you remember that, from 1990 to 1992. And at the 2000 Sydney Olympics, Paul was a composer for the opening and closing ceremonies and the musical director for the Paralympics closing ceremony. He has won 3 ARIA Awards, an IFI Award, a Helpman Award, and was Sydney Mire Performing Artist of the Year in 2000. In 2007, Paul was awarded the Melbourne Prize for Music, which was worth $60,000. That's a lot of money, Paul. And what are we paying tonight? Paul was the director of the 2000 Adelaide Festival and of course is also our H.C. Coombs Creative Arts Fellow. Quite uniquely, and this is the first time in the history of the H.C. Coombs Fellowship, it's Paul and the Australian Art Orchestra. And when I put that concept to the university, it was embraced with great enthusiasm, even though nothing quite like it had ever been proposed before. And part of course, the Australian Art Orchestra family was the young Wagalak musicians who came down for for the Crossing Roper Bar project recently. Paul has also been engaging with the school, most valuably to us, in discussions about the future of music education in the higher education sector. We had a most profitable 2 hours with him this afternoon where I'm not sure he challenged us or we challenged him, about some of the directions we could possibly take. And it was wonderful to have his critical mind sort of looking at some of the concepts that we're coming up with, which I think are quite groundbreaking. So in Paul, we found an ideal partner to develop further some of these ideas. So it gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome our H.C. Coombs Creative Arts Fellow for 2010, Paul Grabowsky. Thank you.
Hi there, folks. It's a real honour to be asked to speak to you this evening, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And Adrian, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. I'm sure I don't deserve any of it, but here we go. A couple of days ago, I met with a leading orchestral conductor of my generation, a European, and therefore by default an heir to the cultural inheritance of that part of the world which has stamped itself so indelibly on our collective psyche that we pretend to know it without necessarily knowing much about it. We might speak of a Western inheritance, but we need to be careful to be clear, particularly in the context of what I'm going to talk about tonight, about what that might mean with regard to music in this day and age. When people rail against what they perceive to be the shortcomings of this type of music or that type of music, they are as guilty of stereotyping as any casual newspaper columnist. And their opinions, and let's be clear that in the majority of cases that's exactly what they are, might even be converted into structures of knowledge which underpin the pedagogical frameworks which will educate, or not, a generation or two. So it was interesting to hear what Christian Järvi had to say. We spoke about music as an action, as something realised in real time at a high level of accomplishment. And we spoke about the idiosyncrasies of the musical moment within our respective experiences. He was in rehearsal with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra for Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. A good place to start a conversation, as it is demonstrative of certain triumphs, which at the same time might be seen as shortcomings of the way musical information is communicated. And I'll return to this theme in a little while. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, music is the art of combining sounds or voices or instruments to achieve beauty of form and expression of emotion. One of the aims of this talk will be to explore whether or not that definition stands up and what we can learn about alternative definitions of music. One thing that I believe about music is that it is most definitely a language. If by language, again returning to concise Oxford, we mean a vocabulary and a way of using it. Like the English language, music has evolved in ways that centuries ago would have been inconceivable. 3 or 4 years ago, music was at the centre of the culture war surrounding education syllabuses in some Australian schools. A proposed curriculum out of Perth felt that computers and turntables were musical instruments in their own right and could be studied on their own terms. A howl of protest ensued. Letters and articles appeared in the national press, and the proposed curriculum, with its seeming disregard for the fundamentals of music making, was consigned to the waste paper basket through the intervention, no less, of the then Premier of Western Australia, citing his own daughter's violin lessons as an example of the kind of music education he saw as appropriate. This might seem like a sideshow in the great circus of our democracy, but it is emblematic of the search for meaning in a society so over-endowed with information that it stumbles to adhere to principles. So let's try and put this into an historical and cultural context. The history of Western music usually starts with the emergence of Gregorian chant in the monasteries of the so-called Dark Ages, though even here we are now able to point to the emerging of compositional consciousness in the Carolingian West. It then proceeds through the development of a system of notation attributed to one Guido of Arezzo in the 11th century, the systematic rising of vocal polyphony during the High Middle Ages, resulting in works of tremendous complexity and artifice, the troubadour ballads and love songs and their accompanying instrumental counterparts, all eventually leading to such high Renaissance masters as Dufay and Gabrielli, etc., finally Monteverdi, who gave us what is regarded as the first real opera, Orfeo, in 1607. This is, needless to say, a thoroughly imprecise overview. Nevertheless, there are two things about it that I would like to draw your attention to. One is that musicology itself causes us to reinterpret our musical past and the performative realities associated with it for any particular period. Another thing we could say is that during that whole span mentioned, 1,000 years really, a central fact of musical life as we know it did not even exist. And I speak of the tempered scale, which divides the octave into 12 equal parts. We all know what a piano keyboard looks like, with its peculiar layout of black and white keys. Well, that concept only really emerged during the early 18th century, the result of experimentation by the great organ builders of northern Germany. For the first time, composers and players were able to modulate at will into more and more remote keys. We now arrive at a language of music with structures in which keys and the material which define them, namely the organisation of multiple voices into harmonies, dominate the musical narrative. And indeed the whole idea of narrative, in which music starts to tell a story, which the listener has to imagine as the sounds float past, is a fairly recent invention, some 200 odd years old. So whereas 500 years ago a composer might build elaborate and arcane number symbolism into a cappella vocal music in order to embed a secret religious message, we now had Wagner using sweeping orchestration played by technologically sophisticated instruments grouped in that quintessential paragon of the industrial era, the orchestra. So really what we have come to think of as the standard by which music is defined as a noble pursuit, morally and ethically uplifting and making us more rounded citizens of democracy, is not that old. It is the product of changes, historical and especially technological. Valves on brass instruments and complex keyed systems on woodwinds are 19th century innovations, and they continue to be developed now. So why am I telling you all this? Because for a start, I dispute totally the idea that a computer or turntable is not a musical instrument worthy of study in a foundational music syllabus. Do these things lack historical pedigree as bona fide musical instruments? I think not. The first electronic instruments started to appear during the 1920s. The theremin, which dominated B-movie soundtracks during the 50s, made a splash when it first appeared. It attempted to imitate the sound of the human voice, and was soon joined by the trautonium, favoured by the composer and multi-instrumentalist Paul Hindemith, and the onde martineau, an electronic instrument great for swooping glissandi, a favourite of Olivier Messiaen, and finally by the synthesizer. The first synthesizers were megaliths. Future archaeologists may think, like Vico, that the world was once populated by giants as they unearth the early electronic music studios in Cologne and Princeton, where pioneers like Stockhausen and Babbitt were handcrafting new sounds out of individual sine waves, the very stuff of sound itself. I once visited the great Stockhausen at the famous studio, where his assistant, Klaus, proudly showed me the Bakelite knob that once controlled the voltage to a 1950s oscillator, as if it were the Holy Grail. Bob Moog patented a synth small enough to be sold commercially during the mid-60s, and the emergence of digital technology in the 80s has proven to be the cause of a synthesizer-based musical revolution, as great in its implications as the emergence of the tempered scale. So now I want to ask the question again, what is music? We've looked at Western music so far, and most people's experience of that particular tradition will involve music written between 1750 and, say, 1950. That is, if they happen to be concert goers. If they go to the movies, they will experience contemporary orchestral music that sometimes openly plagiarises various 20th century composers, and sometimes speaks with originality when it is not buried in a sonic barrage of effects, as seems to be increasingly the case. But because it is a film they are watching, in most cases, unless they have a particular interest in film music, it will pass by without them knowing nor caring what the sources and inspirations may have been. The career path of the classically trained musician, as we understand that term in its conventional usage, and let's be real about this, leads to very few outcomes in the field of musical performance. Many will end up being teachers themselves. A few might luck out and land a gig in a symphony orchestra, where tenure is now largely a thing of the past. A precious few might try their luck as soloists, where their chances of hitting the world circuit are more remote than playing professional golf or tennis. The language of Western music, in the sense of classical music, is simply not enough to create the complete musician of the 21st century. The paradigms that have dominated music education for the last few generations are no longer adequate. Let's now have a look at alternative musical languages and where they begin to impact on the question of what music is. The first and dearest to my heart is the dynamic music we call jazz. A child of many parents, born out of wedlock. One would have to say jazz is redolent with irony. In his book Blues People, Leroy Jones talks about the psychological reality of being a slave in the Americas during the first half of the 19th century. A slave was a chattel in the eyes of the state, not a human being. A nothing, born to work until death, with no sense of the basic things we take for granted, like dignity, self-worth, freedom. It is sobering to think that while Liszt was wowing them on the concert stages of Europe, many of those brand new venues were a product of economies which depended on slavery, whether we are talking textiles, tobacco, or sugar. So, with Brahms busily at work on his first symphony, America drowned in blood for a few years and the slaves were freed. Or were they? Not for long, or not really. Other kinds of slavery took over as their rights were revoked and institutionalized racism led to an urban and rural underclass or segregated communities with their own form of social mobility. This was certainly the case in New Orleans, where under the Catholic inheritance of French-speaking culture, far more had been preserved of African tradition for far longer than in the more conservative Protestant Puritan North, where anything remotely pagan was ruthlessly suppressed, all of which should be painfully familiar to Indigenous Australians and Pacific Islanders. Jazz was the counterattack of the Black American, with its offbeat rhythms, its brass band instrumentation poking fun at the four-squareness of the military, its exotic language of smears, growls, and percussion devices leading to the overt sexuality of swing. Swing is what happens when one rhythmic layer exists with another one in a simmering tension of give and take. The bottom end wants to push and the top end wants to lay back, but only a little bit each way. Enough for the music to feel good. Now there's a new concept. Feel. You don't hear Chopin enthusiasts talking about it, perhaps because the accepted aesthetics surrounding the eros of Chopin admits to more of head than body, whereas the eros of jazz involves the sensuality of the dance, that great human mating ritual. Now, this Dionysian force was accompanied by another radical innovation of 20th century culture, the gramophone. Just as well, really, because without the gramophone, we wouldn't have recorded the uniqueness of the great jazz performances containing, as they do, improvisation. What had happened to improvisation? Well, it depends where you look. Because, of course, it had been happening, one assumes, forever, on the undocumented level of folk music. In fact, apart from the somewhat sanitised, or at least highly stylised idea of folk tunes and rhythms that we hear from time to time in composers like Beethoven, Haydn, the Russians, Mahler, etc., it took the gramophone to show us what that folk music really sounded like when composers like Bartók and Granger went around collecting songs and recording the people who sang and played them. Improvisation used to be a central part of performance practice until at least the late 18th century. J.S. Bach and his sons, particularly the unfortunate Wilhelm Friedrich, were wonderfully gifted improvisers, and Mozart would routinely improvise on themes suggested to him by audience members at recitals. But it disappeared pretty much entirely from music education during the 19th and 20th centuries, except if you were trained as an organist, where improvised counterpoint was still on the agenda. Surprisingly, and particularly within some pedagogical spheres, some classical purists are still inclined to look down their noses at jazz. Why is this? What is it about the language of jazz that gets up their noses? Is it the preponderance of saxophones and brass? Is it the seeming formlessness of a music that often relies on the repetition of structures of relatively short duration at a constant tempo? Or is it the torrents of notes that seem to pour mercilessly from greater and particularly from lesser soloists? Is it the wildness? Is it the spontaneity, the urgency? Is it the vitality? Is it the joy? I know from some lovers of pop, a music whose slavish adherence to formalism has great similarities to conventional classical performance, that they find jazz too note-heavy and serious, too intellectual, that they don't get it, which can only mean they don't listen. Jazz, an utterly romantic form, which you could say pits the artist/hero in a titanic struggle with his or her own ego, is the great night music, the music of neon, of the city, of Edward Hopper, Jackson Pollock, Henry Miller, of Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Shanghai, of course New York. It went on to spread its wings to become the brooding lay of the fjords, a code word for freedom in Cold War Eastern Europe. And indeed, with the music of Bernie McGann or the Necks, an expression of the vast space and dryness of Australia. This music, the marrying of intellect with passion, which spins on the pinhead of real time, the result of untold billions of spontaneous decisions, is a metaphor for the life force itself. Its lessons are legion, but the biggest one is about the connection of the player to the instrument. That in order to be able to really do it, the player and the instrument must become one. Then there is the supple relationship that jazz musicians have to rhythm, the feeling of a music not based on the bar line, but on pulse, a music in which constant forward momentum, in which harmony, not necessarily subservient to any grand scheme, is enjoyed for its own sake, simply as sound. This is the great achievement of post-slavery Black America, Jewish America, Italian America, a music born out of synthesis, which continues to morph into various versions of itself wherever it puts down roots, a music of process, the music closest to human speech in its asymmetrical phrasing, and now a music which involves, who would have thought, turntablists and computer players. So why the particular venom towards the turntable? The first practitioners were working in Paris in the early 50s, collecting found sounds and creating collages with them, so-called musique concrète. Black culture discovered the joys of the turntable in the 70s when Jamaican Toastmasters used them for improvised performances of street poetry, the origin of rap music. So, like computer music, there is a history, often surprising, and there are acknowledged masters of the form. The turntable, a wonderful tool for referencing all kinds of things in a postmodern sense, is of course related to the sampler, an instrument whose ability to be all things to all people is both its strength and its weakness. But surely the well-tempered keyboard must have looked like that in 1720. It's not the box, but the brain that controls it that matters. But given that we have a musical history involving electronica and sampling technologies that goes back 80 years, it seems absurd to me that these things should not be considered musical instruments. By what criteria are these claims made? The hydraulic organ must have seemed strange in ancient Rome, the theorbo in Mantua, the serpent in London, and the ophicleider in Paris. But just because you may not play a scale on a computer, it doesn't make it a lesser being than a violin. You can create an infinite number of scales with every conceivable type of tuning. There are various types of synthesis of varying degrees of complexity. It is all a matter of what is taught and allowing for a degree of historical contextualization. There is also the fact that for many young people, the first encounter with music as performance may well be through instruments and technologies associated with rap, hip-hop and other urban forms, largely dependent on these instruments and, incidentally, not averse to improvisation at very high levels of accomplishment. In the 1950s, having studied with a Japanese Zen master, the American composer John Cage composed the notorious 4 minutes and 33 seconds for solo piano. During the piece, the pianist is told not to play, but has to give the impression of there being 3 movements. This is often achieved by opening and closing the keyboard lid. What is Cage telling us about music? That music is at least partially the result of a conscious act of engagement by the listener. Now, this is far away from the concise Oxford definition. This talks about an act. The most extreme of positions is about a renunciation, a giving over to space itself. Stravinsky famously said on being told of 4 minutes 33 seconds that he looked forward to works of major length from Mr. Cage. But what it does suggest is that there are many ways of looking at music, and that therefore there can be many ways of talking about it. During the past 5 years, I've been a part of a journey of discovery into the musical processes of a particular type of music with a particular clan in Nooka, in southeastern Arnhem Land. The way this happened is itself an indication of the power of music to connect people. I received a call one day out of the blue, a couple of years, well actually 5 or 6 years ago, from a man who had been an ex-student of mine at the Victorian College of the Arts. He was about to commence a master's program in jazz piano and was interested in having me supervise his studies. Now, the idea of travelling from Melbourne to Darwin, as Adrian I'm sure would be aware, to teach piano didn't exactly float my boat, I have to say. So I wanted to know more about what a student of jazz was doing there at all, where there are virtually no jazz musicians. As it turned out, this fellow, whose name is Steve Teakle, also known as Stretch, was far more than an aspiring jazz musician. A natural musician in many styles, he has played with many kinds of bands and is a gifted songwriter and storyteller. He had been running TAFE courses in remote communities in the Northern Territory, places like Kintore and Nooka. in which he would arrive with instruments and recording equipment and work with bands in these communities, sometimes touring with them, certainly spending months with them, and often in the company of his wife and young children. This last fact is particularly significant in that he was able to establish a large degree of trust between himself and the people in the community. So I agreed to teach him jazz piano if he would take me somewhere where I might make contact with some players of traditional music. He suggested Nooka, a traditional meeting place of the surrounding nations, who had been murderously treated by whites, particularly in association with the huge stock drives which would pass through that country. Contemporary music has played an important role in that community for many years. A particular band, the Yugal Blues Band, has been together with some of its original members since 1968. Nooka also boasts one of the most interesting and diverse visual arts cultures in Australia and was the home of the great painter Ginger Riley. We drove down there at the end of the wet season. Nooka is on the mighty Roper River, and the road in was still cut. So we entered the town by barge, black cockatoos all around us. Within a few minutes of arriving, during a stroll through the town, I met a young man by the name of Benjamin Wilfred, a songman, dancer, and yidaki, or didgeridoo player. I explained that I was a musician and that I wanted to talk about the music of his clan tradition. He was pleased to talk about this, as he takes particular pride in ceremony and in his role as a musician. His people, the Wagaluk, are respected as keepers of ceremony for many of the surrounding nations. The next day he turned up with an old man called Roy Wilfred. Roy is an elder and therefore the holder of knowledge which would be passed in stages on to Benjamin. We sat for a while and I told him about some of the things that I do. I had recently made a recording of some of my compositions in New York with the great Australian trumpeter Scott Tinkler and some American jazz musicians, some of them quite well known. I had brought it along and the music poured out of a ghetto blaster. It felt very strange to be listening to that music in such a non-jazz environment. Benjamin then remarked that in fact he'd been to New York not that long ago as part of a traditional dance group, so already my assumptions were coming undone. In fact, I think they really enjoyed the spirit of the music because after politely listening to it, they began to teach me a song, a maniquet. I didn't realise that that was what was happening at the time. It was only on my return to the community some time later that it was clear to me that the process had begun. Roy would sing a phrase accompanied by Benjamin, and then Benjamin would show me the action which would normally accompany the song. This particular one was a hunting sequence involving preparing a spear thrower, aiming and throwing a spear. Simple enough, you might think, until you start to realise that in Australian Indigenous culture, there are numerous song cycles involving numerous people and places, actions both mythic and historical, or something in between. In fact, you come to realise that virtually everything can be and is sung into existence, and that the universe is comprehended through an elaborate and gradually revealed series of complex metaphors. This is a difficult thing to grasp in our society, in which music, like everything else, is either made or consumed. We have forgotten the original purpose of music, which has something to do with expressing the continuous act of creation, which is the meaning of life. The sense that the creation is ever present, that the infinite past is implicit in the present, and that the present is already both past and future. Thus, music is a way of changing the mode of one's relationship with one's surroundings into, let's say, a mythical mode in which the eternal past lives anew. No wonder, then, that it is tied up with magic and with healing. I have sat with my skin father, a man called Kevin Rogers, as he sings of his ancestor, and the force of intense identification achieved with that being through the song is something to be marvelled at, and that was in a motel room in Darwin. Imagine then what it is like out in country, because the other great fact about this music is that it is inextricably linked with place. That the song cycle maps a place, that the heightened sense of language which song provides imbues the words with power. In the beginning was the Word, says the Gospel of John. No wonder the Gnostics write of God singing the universe into being, because that is the power behind Indigenous music. There is something that happens in these songs which repeat verses for a while before the next begins, and somehow the pitch world of the melody seems to be rising, as does the intensity. At the end of the line, which is never too long, the melody trails off in a descending melismatic cascade of great beauty and soul. And depending on how many voices are taking part, the result can be this kind of non-synchronous unison, many voices singing together, but each slightly different. And then there is the quality of the voices, with a yearning, powerful sense of summoning time itself to open up, to translate us into that mythic mode. So while beauty of form and expression of emotion are undoubtedly two things that might help to describe music, surely its power to express the inexpressible would have to be another. I returned to Nooka over a year later with Archie Roach and the great and sadly departed Ruby Hunter, and a group of musicians drawn from the Australian Art Orchestra, a group I founded in 1994, one of whose aims is to achieve a high level of music making through cross-cultural collaborations. It is with this spirit of serious collaboration that we went to Nooka. Benjamin, Roy and the others sat down with our ensemble of violin, soprano sax, trombone, trumpet, bass clarinet, guitar, drums and double bass. They began to sing and explained that this was a song called Black Crow. Our musicians asked to listen to it a number of times and then played it back to them. This was a moment etched in my memory forever. The look of surprise and delight on the faces of our hosts, the fact that here were white fellas sitting at their feet wanting to learn their music and actually making a version of it which they recognised as being close in spirit at least to what they actually do. Not some Western version of it with all the microtonal inflections and gritty textures removed. Now, musicians who are only raised within traditional Western paradigms, could they have achieved this level of communication? I greatly doubt it. For a start, most of them never learned to play in tune, let alone out of tune, with a purpose in mind. To locate microtones on an instrument, you have to have a pretty damn good idea of where all the notes on your instrument are and where they sit in relation to other instruments. Every instrument has its own internal logic as far as tuning goes, keys that aren't naturally resonant and keys that are. This is the basis of a philosophy called harmolodics, the invention of the great philosopher king of contemporary improvisation, Ornette Coleman. But that would have to be the subject of a separate lecture. So great was the enthusiasm of the Wamut mob that the senior songman was summoned, the great artist Sambo Burabura, and he too gave his approval. We were then told we had all become members of the Wamut clan and that our responsibilities to that status would begin immediately. We were taught some dance steps and ordered to perform in a bungal, and everyone did it without question. This was all part of the collaboration. Since that time, we have gone to many places playing this music. And we have mixed it up, as they like to say. Benjamin Wilfred has responded not just through playing, but through controlling this process of improvising, bringing musicians in and out of the conversational flow. This notion is at the heart of my concept of music as language, and it is in the spirit of collaboration and communication that the Australian Art Orchestra has worked in recent years with musicians from different musical language groups, from Bali, from South India, with classical musicians, with musicians from pop and rock, and increasingly with musicians from our Indigenous communities. The reason why I believe our collaborations are successful is the rigorous way we go about them. Tuning is an interesting example of an idea which can have totally different meanings in different musical cultures, even within them. I talked earlier about the development of the equally tempered scale and how it allowed instruments to play in all 12 keys. So the idea of F-sharp major didn't exist before the early 18th century, pretty much because it would have sounded very weird. Intervals played in pre-modern times were true, i.e. based on natural laws of vibrations in air, whereas the intervals we use in our chromatic scale have been adjusted. So our thirds would have sounded out of tune to the ears of earlier ages. Tuning is all about relativity. In jazz, there are some great soloists who choose to play slightly sharp in order to really cut above a band to brighten their sound. Orchestras often tune higher than the standard concert A of 440 Hz, again to brighten the sound. Early music ensembles, on the other hand, might go the other way, where A might be 430 or even lower. Relativity. In Balinese music, tuning is incredibly important, but in a way which would send the door bitches of classical music education into paroxysms of wrath. Every village in Bali has a gamelan, which is an orchestra made up of various instruments. Many of them are mallet percussion instruments, arranged in pairs which face each other. They are made of a particular alloy, which gives them a clangorous sound, which can travel long distances over the gorgeous paddies and valleys of that island. The musical ability of these ensembles is legendary. In Bali, where the gamelan style called kebya is often fast and furious, passages of intricate melodic construction are created out of the interlocking of instruments playing different parts, one on the beat and the other on the offbeat. This technique, once an inspiration to an earlier generation of composers, later went on to influence American minimalists like Philip Glass and Steve Reich. The issue of Balinese tuning is this. The two instruments facing each other must be out of tune in order to create that rich clash of overtones so characteristic of music throughout Southeast Asia. In fact, Balinese people can recognise the distinctive character of particular village groups due to the particular out-of-tuneness of the gamelan. So you can imagine what a business it is to combine Western and Balinese instruments, a challenge I had to overcome with my collaborator on a particular project, the enfant terrible of Balinese music, Wayan Udana. Again, an ensemble was chosen that could adapt. Trombone with its slide, violin and guitar with their tunable strings, saxophone with its alternative fingerings. It took a whole week before we were able to say that the combination of 5 Balinese and 6 Western musicians had found their common ground. But once they did, the results were miraculous. And again, proof that music is able to overcome these seemingly impossible barriers. In fact, so used did we become to this unique sound world we were living in, that when I came around to listening to a wonderful classical orchestra playing some masterpiece of the canon, it sounded incredibly bland because of the straight-jacketed tuning. You see, tuning itself is an expressive device, as demonstrated by the village gamelan or by a band like Sonic Youth, which routinely employs detuning of its guitars to great expressive effect. We show scant regard for music in the way in which we use it. In our shopping malls, our restaurants, and at our sporting events, we generally show off our Philistinism with aplomb. Why anyone would want to add the insult of the in-store selection of hits and memories to the mind-numbing absurdity of supermarket shopping is a mystery to me. Maybe they just want us in and out in the quickest possible time. Hospitals are an interesting case in point. During a recent period where I had a very sick son, I had occasion to spend more time than I would ever wish at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. I had plenty of opportunity to reflect on the ambient sounds of that environment, largely dominated by kiddie television, unsurprisingly, and figured that there is much to be done towards the creation of benign ambience in places where stress reigns. And I don't mean through the hovering presence of a synthesizer accompanied by birdsong and running water. There is an extraordinary doctor in Melbourne called Catherine Crock who has begun a series of recordings featuring often classical music, which she plays in rooms where medical procedures are performed to help create a reassuring feeling. I met her and she asked if I would like to be involved, and it immediately occurred to me that a type of jazz music is far more likely to succeed in creating the atmosphere she was looking for. And that has something to do with the air in the music. Its light tripping rhythms, the elegant combination of certain high register sounds with the supply dancing bass. Anyway, I wrote a suite of 12 pieces with these notions in mind, and it turns out that this is the music that most people wanted played in these situations. Who would have thought that jazz would have made this transition from the brothels of New Orleans to the wards of a children's hospital? But there you go. Music defies expectations, bridges cultures, defines spaces. It articulates time and space, it tells stories, elevates language, empowers listeners and players alike. Music never lies. One thing that musicians have to learn to understand is their own process and how to own it. As improvisers, we learn to speak a language and hone it until it becomes a powerful, expressive tool. It is rather like being a composer, but in real time. That process only starts to reveal itself in hindsight and over a considerable period of time. There was a time in my mid-20s when I would record every performance I did. Listening back was an agony. All I could hear was how little I sounded like my heroes, in spite of what I thought were my best endeavours. It finally dawned on me that what I was in fact hearing was the emergence of my own voice, and that I had to start listening quite differently to it, that I had to accept it for what it was, and identify what I wanted to work on in order to strengthen it. From that time on, practice became a different set of challenges, actually far preferable, because it was all my own, not somebody else's. This is also a challenge facing classical musicians, how to break through the tyranny of text to the point where the performance, not the work, is the thing. This is where Glenn Gould and Casals got to with Bach, or Michelangelo with Debussy. But many would argue that it is the text or the work which must always win. Interesting, because such a wide gulf separates various interpretations of Beethoven between, say, the broad tempi of Furtwängler with the Berlin Phil and John Eliot Gardiner with his period instrument performances and much faster speeds. Being a fan of the new old approach, the traditionalists sound plodding to my ears, but that really says more about my own listening experiences and tastes than it does about the performances or the music. Christian Järvi made the interesting observation to me that the symphony orchestra is based on an anachronistic business model. He's a conductor. It has become axiomatic that our civilization is defined in part by such models, that we would somehow be uncivilized without them. That may be so. But why then are these ostensibly indispensable ensembles forced into grotesque parodies of themselves as guns for hire in laser spectaculars, or playing pastiche arrangements behind rock bands, while playing real contemporary music, by which I mean music designed to show off an orchestra to its advantage, in which the musicians play to their strengths, is the lowest priority on their collective agendas, unless it is music designed not to challenge either players or audiences. Could it be that times have changed? Indeed. The state, which gave birthrights to orchestras under the understanding of privilege, is now unwilling to foot the bill in an era where the assumption of superiority is under threat. The promise of a fulfilling orchestral musical journey is not a given. The musicians of the future will be looking elsewhere and will need the skills base implied by the examples I have given to stake out meaningful careers. Audiences need to be educated, which is another topic of extreme importance to do with primary and secondary education. But if our musicians are educated to understand the true nature of the moment of making music, then they stand a greater chance of taking their audiences with them on their voyage of discovery, be that in a symphony orchestra or in whatever future may be in store. So there you are then. Music is an experience shared between player and listener, or between composer and listener via the player, who in many cases will be the composer of an experience only ever to be heard once in that form. You know, not even a recording can change that, because every time you listen to the same recording, no matter how many times you hear it, it will always be different, dependent as it is on your state of mind, age, location, etc. Music reflects who we are, what we aspire to, our limitations, and our boundless capacity for abstract thought. At its best, it posits a better world. At its worst, a mind-numbing banality, even brutality, with a fitting soundtrack. It is limitless, it is ever-changing, it is only ever going to be what people are, and therefore we should do everything within our power to make it both available and integrated into our lives. I can't help saying these things. I didn't say a word until I was 2, and then it was Craven A. Filter, Michael. He was my brother, 16 years older and a musician, and I clearly was interested in what he smoked. He would give me 78 RPM shellac records as presents, and I would try and wipe the scratches off them with soap and water. I was never going to be anything else. So I guess the idea of music as a language rings true to me, as I believe it is the language I speak, and as I have hopefully shown tonight, have spoken across cultural and social divides. I've seen the power of music at work, and I believe in that power. It is essential that an experiential, practical, and holistic understanding of that power lies behind the higher education of all modern musicians, regardless of what they end up playing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. As always, I find Paul's presentations, in whichever language he chooses, the spoken word or music, equally as uplifting. I related earlier at a meeting how after the performance of Crossing Roper Bar the other night, it made me want to go home and pick up my 19th century guitar and play early Italian guitar music. One might wonder what the connection is. The connection is, I got a creative surge from listening to Paul's performance, and creativity is not linked to a musical genre. Creativity exists in everything we do, and I thought it was wonderful the way Paul framed that as music as an uplifting and essential part of our lives. I feel uplifted. I feel like going home and playing my 19th century guitar. In actual fact, if you'd like to join us, we're going to go for a drink rather in the green room back to celebrate. So look, again, thank you very much to Paul for a most wonderful public lecture as our ANU H.C. Coombs Creative Arts Fellow. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.